In the 18th century, a simple white crystal possessed the same strategic dominance that oil holds over the modern world. We view it today as a common table condiment, but 300 years ago, it was the only technology capable of pausing time, acting as the sole barrier standing between a sailor's rations and lethal biological decay. Without this specific chemical, the massive navies of Europe could not leave port, and the great cities would face the threat of famine every winter. But this vital resource was not mined from the deep earth. It was farmed from the chaotic surface of the ocean. To extract it, engineers had to turn miles of wild coastline into a precise hydraulic machine, battling the tides and the weather to wring a solid rock out of liquid water. The creation of a salt works in the mid-18th century begins not with the salt itself, but with a mastery of hydraulic engineering that rivals the complexity of any fortress or cathedral construction of the era. To turn the chaotic ocean into an orderly production line, the master salter must first conquer the coastline, selecting a low-lying expanse of tidal flat, where the clay soil is impermeable enough to hold water without leaking, yet malleable enough to be shaped into precise basins. This is a landscape sculpted by the shovel and the wheelbarrow, where hundreds of laborers, often working knee-deep in heavy, sulfurous mud, construct a labyrinth of dikes and canals designed to harness the gravitational power of the moon. They build a massive seawall, the primary defense against the ocean's rage, fitted with a main sluice gate that acts as the grand valve of the entire operation. This gate is opened only during the high spring tides, allowing the sea to rush into the primary reservoir, a vast holding tank where the water rests and the suspended silt and sand are allowed to settle, leaving the liquid clear before its journey begins. Inside this perimeter, the layout is a testament to rigorous geometric planning designed to facilitate a continuous gravity-fed flow that requires no pumps, only the subtle manipulation of levels. The water is guided from the main reservoir into a series of successively smaller and shallower condensing ponds, often arranged in a serpentine pattern to maximize the surface area exposed to the sun and wind. Each transition is controlled by small wooden gates or simple plugs, operated by the salter who walks the narrow, slippery earthen banks with the vigilance of a sentry. The construction of these banks is a ceaseless task. The clay must be packed down tight with wooden mallets to prevent seepage, reinforced with woven willow or stones to resist erosion from the very water they contain. The physical toll of maintaining this infrastructure is immense, as the corrosive nature of the salt water eats away at wood and iron alike, requiring a cycle of repair that begins the moment the harvest season ends, often occupying the workforce throughout the cold, wet winter months in preparation for the summer campaign. The human element in this phase is defined by an intimate knowledge of the local topography and the rhythm of the tides, a wisdom passed down through generations of families who live on the edge of the marsh. The master salter does not merely watch the water. He reads the sky for signs of impending rain, which is the mortal enemy of the salt works, capable of undoing weeks of evaporation in a single hour. He calculates the flow based on the anticipated heat of the coming days, releasing just enough water from the reservoir to keep the system moving without flooding the lower levels. It is a precarious balance, maintained in a landscape that smells of brine, decaying seaweed, and the distinct metallic tang of the marsh mud. The silence of the flats is broken only by the cry of coastal birds and the rush of water through the sluices, a deceptive tranquility that masks the immense potential energy being channeled into the evaporation beds, setting the stage for the invisible chemical transformation that will soon take place under the blazing sun. Once the clarified seawater enters the circuit of condensing ponds, the process shifts from hydraulic engineering to a slow, deliberate alchemy, driven entirely by the renewable energy of solar radiation and coastal breezes. As the water meanders through the shallow channels, often no more than a few inches deep, The sun acts as a relentless fire, evaporating the fresh water and causing the salinity to climb steadily. This is not a passive waiting game. The salter must actively manage the flow, pushing the brine forward with long-handled wooden scoops or simply by adjusting the sluices, ensuring that the liquid never stagnates but moves at a pace that matches the rate of evaporation. In the 18th century, without modern hydrometers, the salter relies on organic indicators to judge the density of the brine. He watches for the appearance of specific algae that tint the water distinct shades of green and then a rusty pink. Or he might float a fresh egg or a beeswax ball in the channel, knowing that when it bobs halfway above the surface, the brine has reached the critical saturation point necessary for the next stage. The atmosphere in the salt pans during high summer is one of blinding intensity, where the reflection of the sun off the thousands of acres of water creates a dazzling, mirror-like expanse that burns the skin and strains the eyes. The heat is compounded by the lack of shade, as trees are strictly forbidden near the pans to prevent leaves from falling into the brine and to ensure the wind has an unobstructed path to scour the water's surface. This wind is just as vital as the sun. A dry, stiff breeze can accelerate production significantly, while a humid, still day can bring the entire operation to a grinding halt. The workers move through this shimmering heat haze like ghosts, their bodies wrapped in loose linen to ward off the sun, their skin tanned to the color of leather and crusted with a fine layer of dried salt. They are constantly skimming the surface of the condensing ponds to remove scum, insects, and wind-blown dust, knowing that any impurity introduced at this stage will inevitably end up in the final crystal, lowering its grade and its price on the market. As the brine travels further down the chain, its volume decreases while its weight increases, transforming from simple seawater into a thick, oily liquor that feels slick between the fingers. This concentrated solution is a volatile substance. If it becomes too salty before reaching the crystallizing pans, it will deposit gypsum and other bitter minerals that act as contaminants, ruining the taste of the edible salt. The salter's skill lies in preventing this premature precipitation, keeping the brine moving until it is perfectly primed, a saturation of roughly 25 degrees Beaumet, to use a later measure, but known then simply by the taste and the oiliness of the water. The tension in the workforce rises as the brine approaches this critical state, for the labor invested over the past weeks is now concentrated in this liquid gold, and a sudden summer storm could force them to open the emergency drains, flushing away tons of potential profit back into the sea to save the clay beds from being diluted and ruined. The final stage of production takes place in the crystallizers, the smallest and most carefully leveled basins at the very end of the hydraulic circuit, often referred to as the tables or pans. Here, the supersaturated brine is admitted in a shallow layer, rarely exceeding an inch in depth, allowing the crystallization to occur rapidly under the direct assault of the midday sun. As the water vanishes, the first sign of the yield is the appearance of a delicate, shimmering film on the surface, the prized fleur de sel, which forms like a sheet of ice on a pond. This premium product, valued for its delicate flavor and texture, must be harvested with extreme gentleness before it sinks, skimmed off the top using a specialized wooden lath called a loose or a sieve-like shovel. The harvester works with the precision of a jeweler, barely disturbing the water, holding his breath to avoid rippling the surface, collecting the flakes into woven baskets where they will drain and dry white as snow, destined for the tables of the aristocracy and the wealthy merchants. Beneath this surface layer, the heavier coarse salt begins to precipitate and settle onto the hard-packed clay floor of the basin, forming a jagged, crystalline carpet. The extraction of this gray salt is a physically demanding task that requires a specific rhythm and a unique tool, a long-handled wooden rake known as a lasse or robble, designed without teeth to scrape the bottom without gouging the clay. The salter pulls the heavy, wet crystals toward the banks, piling them into small pyramids directly in the brine to allow the magnesium-rich mother liquor to drain away. This is back-breaking work performed in the hottest part of the day or the early evening, requiring the worker to bend constantly at the waist, leveraging the rake with calloused hands that are often cracked and bleeding from the constant exposure to the desiccating brine. The sound of the work is a rhythmic crunching, a scraping of wood on salt, accompanied by the heavy breathing of men pushing their endurance to the limit to clear the pans before the sun sets or the weather turns. Once the salt is drawn to the edges, it is scooped up and thrown onto larger conical piles on the raised pathways between the basins, known as moulots or camels. These glittering white mounds, standing like miniature mountains across the flat landscape, are not merely storage heaps, but the trophy of the season's labor, representing the livelihood of the entire community. The visual inspection of the salt is immediate. The master checks for the whiteness of the crystal and the absence of gray mud, scolding any apprentice who dug too deep with the rake. The freshly harvested salt is still wet and heavy, teeming with the biological life of the marsh, and must be left to cure and dry further in the wind, forming a hard crust on the outside of the pile that protects the interior from light rain. As the sun dips low, casting long shadows across the grid of the saltworks, the workforce retreats, their clothes stiff with sweat and salt, leaving the day's production to settle under the starlight, ready to be measured, taxed, and shipped to the preservation vats of the Navy or the curing houses of the Atlantic fisheries. The gleaming white pyramids scattered across the marsh are not yet ready for the hold of a ship. They must first undergo a silent period of maturation that is as chemical as it is logistical. Freshly harvested salt is biting and bitter, laden with magnesium salts and excess moisture that would rot a wooden barrel and spoil the meat it is meant to preserve. For weeks, the salt sits exposed to the elements on the raised earthen platforms, developing a hard outer crust that sheds rainwater like a thatched roof, while the interior drains its bitter mother liquor back into the soil. This curing process is a game of patience played against the coming autumn storms, requiring the saltmaster to constantly inspect the integrity of the mounds, patching cracks with mud or reeds. It is a time of waiting, where the workforce shifts from the frantic pace of the harvest to the heavy labor of maintenance, repairing the clay banks and sluices before the winter tides reclaim the lower levels of the works. However, the greatest anxiety in the salt works during this season comes not from the weather, but from the arrival of the tax collectors, the agents of the state monopoly who view every grain of salt as potential contraband. In the 18th century, salt is a fiscal pillar of the kingdom, and the gabelle or salt tax is enforced with draconian severity. The measuring ceremony is a tense, bureaucratic ritual. The piles are broken down and shoveled into standardized wooden measures, the minute or the bushel, under the watchful, suspicious eyes of uniformed officers who tally every scoop in their ledgers. The workers must strike the measure level with a straight stick, a moment where a trembling hand or a sudden spill can lead to accusations of theft. The air is thick with the dust of the disturbed salt and the murmurs of resentment, for the workers know that a few handfuls hidden in a pocket could mean a flogging or a sentence to the galleys. Yet the temptation to smuggle faux sel remains an ever-present shadow over the production. Once the king's due is recorded, the packing begins, a task of brute force that tests the structural limits of both men and materials. Coopers assemble thousands of barrels from oak or chestnut staves, the hammering of iron hoops echoing across the flats like gunfire, creating containers robust enough to withstand the corrosive cargo and the rough handling of a sea voyage. The salt is shoveled into these barrels or into heavy hemp sacks, packed down tight by men stomping barefoot inside the containers to maximize density and minimize shifting during transport. The weight of salt is deceptive. A single sack is a crushing load, and the porters who carry them to the loading wharves develop distinct deformities of the shoulder and spine from years of bearing the white gold. It is a scene of industrial repetition where the delicate white crystals harvested with a feather-light touch are now treated as heavy bulk tonnage, transformed from a natural wonder into a standardized commodity, ready to fuel the preservation economy of the world. The transport of the salt from the isolated marshy coastlines to the centers of commerce is a logistical nightmare navigated by flat-bottomed barges and shallow draft lighters designed to float on the high tide. The canals and creeks that feed the salt works are often too shallow for ocean-going vessels, so the heavy barrels must be ferried out to the deeper anchorages where merchant ships wait with open hatches. This transfer is a race against the ebb tide. Teams of lightermen pole their heavy craft through the intricate network of channels, shouting commands to avoid grounding on the mudbanks that shift with every storm. The risk is high, for a capsized barge means the total loss of the cargo as it dissolves instantly back into the element from which it came, a financial catastrophe that can bankrupt a merchant house in seconds. The salt is hoisted aboard the larger ships using block and tackle, swinging dangerously over the water before disappearing into the dark, dry holds, packed alongside timber, wine, or iron. This exported salt acts as the lifeblood of the 18th century Atlantic economy, the invisible chemical foundation upon which empires are built and sustained. It is destined for the great curing houses of the port cities or the foggy banks of Newfoundland, where it will turn perishable catches of cod and herring into durable protein capable of lasting for years. Without this salt, the massive naval fleets of Britain, France, and Spain could not leave port, as there would be no way to provision thousands of sailors with salt beef and pork for months at sea. The barrels filled in the quiet, sun-baked marshes are the batteries of the age of sail, storing the energy of food preservation that allows exploration, war, and colonial expansion to continue. The salter, standing in the mud of his pans, is intimately connected to the sailor freezing in the North Atlantic, the connection forged through the chemistry of sodium chloride and the preservation of flesh. Ultimately, the cycle concludes when the salt is dissolved once again, this time in the cooking pot of a peasant or the brine tub of a ship's cook, releasing the flavor of the summer sun and the ocean minerals trapped within the crystal. The immense effort of engineering the coastline, the back-breaking labor of the rake, the anxiety of the harvest, and the tyranny of the taxman all culminate in this simple utility. The salt works settle into the dormancy of winter, flooded intentionally or abandoned to the rain, a gray and desolate landscape waiting for the spring tides to reset the clock. The process leaves behind not just a commodity, but a landscape permanently scarred by human geometry, a testament to the era's determination to wring value from the sea itself, turning the chaotic ocean into a predictable, measurable, and taxable solid. The next time you season a meal, remember that you are tasting the legacy of an empire built on mud, sweat, and the sun. We are dedicated to preserving these forgotten struggles, but we need your help to keep the kiln firing. If you believe these stories of human endurance deserve to be remembered, subscribe to the channel and share this video with someone who values the history behind the everyday. Which other trade do you think shaped the modern world? Tell us in the comments below.